Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. We're going to start our investigation of Canadian history all the way back at the beginning, and that means going back and looking at World War One. To do this, we're going to start by investigating the basic timeline and structure of the war, and from there we'll be able to talk about what's important. So, when we're investigating historical issues, really what we need to remember is that history is not a process of memorizing, but history is a process of investigating. And so it helps to develop some questions for inquiry to start things off. What this does is define the scope of what you're investigating. It looks at sort of what are the areas that I need to find out. In other words, what do I need to learn about this topic that I'm studying? I would suggest that the 5 W's are a pretty good place to start. We all know them: who, what, when, where, why, how. But it's important to remember that those aren't questions in themselves. Those are simply words that are actually a very good starting place for questions. So what I would suggest is that these might be some good questions to start in terms of historical inquiry. We want to know, if I'm investigating World War I, what do I need to find out? Well, I want to know who are the countries that are involved. I want to know when it took place. I want to know where were the important locations. I want to know why it started. I want to investigate what technology was important in World War I. I want to understand what the experience of the war was like for soldiers, and I want to think about what was the lasting impact of the war. Over the course of our study here, these are things that I'm going to try to answer, but I want to start by looking at maybe some of the more basic ones. So the plan for today's video, what I'm going to be investigating is kind of the first couple of concepts. I want to talk about who, I want to talk about when, I want to talk about where, and I want to talk about why World War I started. So that's kind of the scope of where our lesson's going to go today. I'll start with some of the just basic information here. Who were the countries involved in World War I? Well, there were two main groups. There was a group called the Triple Entente, which was made up of France, Russia, and Britain. And there was a group called the Triple Alliance, which was made up of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. When it took place? Well, the war started on August 3rd, 1914, and it went until November 11th, 1918. And the important locations, the war kind of took place on two main areas. Number one was the Western Front, which is kind of the border between France and Germany and Belgium. And on the Eastern Front would be the border between Germany and Russia. So those are the kind of basic facts, the basic information about the war. But in the end here, what have we learned? Well, we have facts, but not context, right? In order for us to really understand this information, what we need to do is dive a little deeper into it. If you knew this information, right, somebody could ask you, hey, what can you tell me about World War I? And you could say this, but the real question is why? Why, for example, was the fighting there? Why did it start on that day? Why were those countries involved? And if all you've memorized is the dates, then you really don't understand the concept. And that's what I'd like to try to investigate here today. Talk a little bit about why these facts are the way that they are. Why were these countries involved in this war? Why was it fought then? Why was it fought there? If we can get to that, then we can really start to understand the history rather than just memorize the facts about it. So let's start by talking about why. I want to first talk about why the war started. And really, this war is no different than any other fight, except it's just on a much larger scale. Why does any fight start? Well, fights start because there's an imagined or a real harm or threat, right? Fights also start when the people who are involved believe that there's something worth fighting over. And fights also start when people have support from others. You can think about, for example, when a fight breaks out between two people, right? There's some kind of grievance, some kind of harm between them, and there's a belief that they can actually win. It's very, very seldom that people start a fight just on their own without that belief that they're going to be able to win it. So that's why fights start. In this particular case, the fights started with there were a number of factors which caused the breakout of the war. There was a growing tension in Europe all throughout the first half, or the first 15 years or so of the 20th century. And it really boils down to kind of three main concepts, which in historical study are often referred to as the isms, right? One of them is nationalism, and this is a belief in or a willingness to fight for your nation. Now, a nation is a group of people with a shared history, culture, language, And oftentimes today our countries are organized around nations. We'll have the American people, they would be a nation. Canadian people would be a nation. If you believe strongly and are willing to fight for your nation, that's when you see feelings of nationalism be very, very strong. And, a good example of this will often appear around the Olympics. When the Olympics are on, we're all walking around and waving flags and wearing jerseys and things of that nature, showing off our pride in our country and our pride in our nation, right? And in Europe in the early 1900s, we see that there's a real sort of nationalistic fever. And there's a bunch of different reasons for this. There had been a couple of wars fought prior to this. The Franco-Prussian War was fought in 1870 to 1871. That led to the creation of the German state, and Prussia actually gave an unexpected defeat to France at the time. The French were very stung by this, and the Germans were very pleased with themselves. And so we end up with a feeling where these nationalist feelings are kind of inflamed at the time. Another one of the isms is militarism, which is a belief in and a willingness to use your military to accomplish your goals, whether it's foreign policy goals or whatever. If you have a strong military and you're not afraid to use it, you can be said to be a militaristic country. And all the countries in Europe were just pouring money into their militaries at the beginning of the 1900s. Britain, for example, launched themselves a brand new class of battleship called the Dreadnought, which essentially made every other naval ship obsolete. And this kicked off a naval race at the start of the 1900s. And all of the countries there were just building up their militaries and were really kind of looking for an excuse to use it. You can think about it like a group of people with brand new toys who really just want to get out and test them out, right? The last ism is sort of a combination of two. It refers to colonialism or imperialism, and both of them are functionally the same thing. It's a belief in expanding your territory, and all the countries in Europe were trying to expand their territory in this sort of great colonial race through the 1800s. Particularly in Africa, every European country except Austria and Russia actually had colonial interests in Africa, whether it's Britain in South Africa, Belgium in the Congo, France in Algeria. We have a whole variety of places in Africa that are basically being carved up and fought over by European countries. And on their own, none of these are especially dangerous. But if you take all of them together, they become quite a toxic mix. And that's kind of what we saw in the first part of the 1900s in Europe. So let me show you a map here of what Europe looked like at the time, because there's one more piece that I'd like to talk about. I said that there was another portion here, another piece of why fights start is that you have support from others. And that was the case in Europe here as well. So we end up with kind of these two main groups in Europe. The ones in pink here are called the Triple Alliance, and that's Germany and Austria-Hungary and Italy, although Italy really kind of is the junior partner in this. Germany and Austria-Hungary are the big ones. That alliance was kind of born out of a conflict in the 1800s where Prussia took dominance of the German states and became a country and called themselves Germany and really kind of established themselves as a leader in Central Europe here. On the other side, we've got France and Russia and Britain, and that became known as the Triple Entente. And that was kind of born out of Franco-Russian alliance of 1892. When you take all these factors together, rising nationalism, growing militarism, colonial conflict, and these alliances, well, we've got all the conditions that are ready for a fight to start. And usually all that it takes is one sort of event, one sort of conflict to kick it off. In Europe, that was called, even at the time, they called it the Powderkeg of Europe. Because essentially what it was a toxic, volatile mix that was just waiting for a spark. Very much like in the cartoons when Yosemite Sam walks into dark cavern, and of course he can't see, so he lights a match and he finds that it's full of gunpowder. Well, Europe was a cavern full of gunpowder at the time, just waiting for a spark to kick it off. And that spark came in 1914 with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria. He was killed in Sarajevo by a group of Bosnian Serbs. And actually, I'm just going to jump back to the map for a second here. I'll point out here, Sarajevo is right down here at the corner of Serbia and Austria-Hungary. And that territory was at one point part of Serbia, but had in 1908 been annexed or taken over by Austria-Hungary. So the people who lived there were understandably upset by this. There was a large portion of Serbs living in Bosnia who considered themselves to be Serbian, not Austro-Hungarian, right? And so there was this constant kind of tension in the area between Serbia and Austria-Hungary. And in June of 1914, the Archduke, the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, was visiting Sarajevo and was killed by a group of Bosnian Serbs. They were an organization called the Black Hand and assassinated him. I mentioned in one of my previous videos that one of the things that we want to do when we study history is to take a look at primary sources. And I've actually got a link here to the Toronto Star. This is their article about the assassination on June 29th, 1914. This is actually a very valuable source because they've taken the time to type it out in legible print. Oftentimes when you read old articles, it's very tough to decipher what is actually being said because the quality is down. But on the 100th anniversary, I think, of the assassination, the Toronto Star reprinted it. And the interesting thing is at the very end of the article, it says, at the moment, it's next to impossible to predict what political results will follow yesterday's tragic events. So even back then, we knew this is a big event, right? This is not one of those things that's going to just disappear. Something is going to be the result of this. We just don't know what. And so, as it turns out, it really was. The assassination of the Archduke kicked off a period called the July crisis. So for the entire month of July, there was a series of rapidly escalating events in Europe, which were increasing the amount of tension and leading Europe down the pathway to war. So I'll try to break it down for you here as sort of simply as I can. In reality, there's an awful lot going on here, but there are a few kind of key moments in July which kind of led us down the pathway to war. Austria-Hungary determined that it was Serbia that was responsible for the assassination, and that's largely true. It was Serbian intelligence who arranged for the assassination and provided the weapons to the terrorists who killed the Archduke, and so Austria-Hungary was understandably quite upset with Serbia at the time. In their dealings with Serbia, Austria-Hungary kind of consulted with Germany and said, hey, Germany, how much leeway do we have to deal with this here? And Germany basically gave Austria what they called a blank check. They said, you do whatever you want to do. We'll support you in this. And so Austria-Hungary made a series of demands against Serbia, and most of them were reasonable, but many of them were not. And the Serbian government refused to accept them. And so we end up with a growing tension between Austria-Hungary and Serbia based on the assassination of the Archduke. Serbia is a Slavic country, ethnically similar to Russia, and Serbia sort of seeks out support from its allies in this case, and Russia mobilizes to help support them. And so now we're bringing an extra country in. And now we're seeing sort of the impact of all of these things. We see nationalism in Serbia, nationalism in Austria-Hungary, which are rising up. We see the alliances kicking in and leading what was actually a very small conflict between two minor countries to bring in the big heavy hitters into the war, right? Because as Russia joins in, so too then does Germany, and so too does France. And all these countries begin to mobilize and get ready for the conflict. That continued all the way through July in this period that we call the July crisis, until eventually the war, we ended up with at a point where war was the only option. or not the only option, but war was the option that these countries decided was best. The war broke out on August the 3rd, 1914. Germany invaded France, but did so by going through Belgium. And this was evidence of a long-standing sort of military tension between the two. The German war plans were set as early as 1905. In our next war with France, here's how we're going to go about doing it. And that tells you something, too, that you've got war plans basically on hold, ready to pull out, and they've been just sitting there for the last 10 years waiting for the next war, right? The reason they went through Belgium was that they figured that the direct border between France and Germany would be very heavily defended, and so they thought the easiest way would be to sort of go around it. It was called the Schlieffen Plan, and it was named after the guy who invented it, who had the decidedly German name of Alfred von Schlieffen. And he sort of came up with this plan to sort of wheel your way around the French defenses by going through Belgium. And so that's where the Germans decided to invade. And this is where we really now get to the sort of the main fighting on the Western Front. And largely that's what I'm going to be focusing on here. This is a Canadian history course. And so this is where most of Canada's fighting was. So largely that's where most Canadian history will talk about these battles here in Belgium and northern France, right? Speaking of Canada, I suppose have to talk about where Canada fit into all of this. Canada was part of the British Empire at the start of 1914. And when Germany invaded Belgium, there was a treaty between Belgium and Britain. And when Germany invaded Belgium, Britain got brought into the war. The entire British Empire was brought into war, and Canada was automatically brought into this war as soon as Britain declared war. So that's the sort of timeline in a fairly, I hope, brief and straightforward way of looking at it. That's the sort of timeline of how the war came to start. And so when I said that here's my plan for the day, these are the main things that I wanted to talk about. Who are the countries involved in the war? Well, we've got Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy on one side. We've got France, Britain, and Russia on the other. And bracketed with Britain, we can probably include Canada there as well. World War I started on August 3rd, 1914. It was fought largely in the northern part of France and in Belgium. At least it was on the Western Front. And it started because of the isms in these alliances. And those isms and alliances, nationalism, militarism, colonialism, imperialism, and the alliance system, those are the really crucial things. These details about who was involved and when it happened are largely secondary to understanding why it happened and understanding why these countries in the beginning of, or in the middle of 1914 went off to war. That's the really crucial piece. That's the context that helps us provide some insight into the facts about why the war began. So that's in a nutshell, in a, I hope, relatively short and straightforward way. That's the way that the war began. But that's really just framing the issue. That's really just kind of laying the groundwork. We also want to talk about how the war was fought, and most importantly, that's going to allow us to talk about how the war was significant, not only in terms of what happened in Europe, but largely for the Canadian history perspective, we'll be talking about why this war is significant to us. But we have a little bit more work to do in terms of framing the conflict. In our next video, in our next lesson, I'd like to talk about the technology of the war and how that sort of influenced the style and the way that the war was fought. So I hope you tune in for that as well. I have included in the upper right-hand corner here my email address, my Twitter handle, and the link to my website. All the information that I put here on my slides today is available on my website, and you can go check it out there. If you enjoyed this content, if you found it useful, if you found it helpful, I would really appreciate if you can like the video by clicking the button down below. And if you want to find out more and you want to follow along through our next lessons, hit the subscribe button as well. And I hope to see you in the next video. Thanks, guys.